let's start with that loot train battle. It was epic. It was huge, and I'd love to talk to you about it.
Yeah, I think the great thing about that episode, first of all, was that I don't think anybody was expecting something quite so epic from a mid-season episode. And if it had the original, the director who was originally scheduled to do the show, David Nutter, done Dance of Dragons and The Red Wedding and the Walk of Shame episode, any serious fan would know that he's one of the show's favorite directors and is generally given the tougher, more important ones. But the thing, they wouldn't have had that clue this year because David unfortunately had to withdraw at the last minute to have back surgery.
Oof. And
they brought in a first-time Game of Thrones director, Matt Shackman, to do the show, whose main claim to fame before that was a lot of episodes of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which was sort of, I think, as far as the director is concerned, casting against type.
Wow.
But obviously, Matt's one of the smartest guys I've ever worked with, and worked very hard at making sure that his Game of Thrones debut was a good one, and the proof is in the pudding. I think it was a great surprise for the fans to have a what would normally be a season climax episode, in the middle of the season.
Looking back on that scene, what was the biggest challenge that you had to overcome?
For a cinematographer on a sequence like that, where you're spending days and days, in this case, I think we were 18 days on just the battle from the time that scene starts to the last shot in the episode. We had a couple of other shooting days on that location that included the opening scene of the episode with the loot train making its way across the prairie. So, you're looking at basically the best part of a month to shoot a scene that takes place over I don't think that scene ran more than 12 or so minutes, 12 or 15 minutes at the most. And when you're dealing with the inconsistencies of weather on shots that are going to be sandwiched right up against each other, that is a DP's biggest nightmare, because you need to have it appear consistent. And if you're doing something that's much smaller and more intimate, just like a dialogue scene, two people riding a horse somewhere, something much more contained like that, even if it were over multiple days, the shots are not of such a big scope that you can't get your big heavy cranes in with your big silks so that you can mitigate the sun if it's coming in at a nasty angle, or bring your lights in to make it look sunny if you have lost the sun. On something of that magnitude and scope, there's no way that you can do that except on maybe some of the close-ups. So I knew going in that was going to be our biggest struggle, and to a certain point, you can control things photographically with how you treat the contrast between a sunny and a not sunny day. But the big my big ace in the hole was the fact that once the dragon has struck the loot train, there was an excuse to have a vast amount of smoke. And I had in the past on various shows used smoke to blot the sun out when the scene, the mood and tone of the scene and subject matter were such that you really didn't want a nice, pretty sunny day. And Matt Shackman, the director, and I both sort of came in with the same visual references, one of them being the napalm attack and helicopter attack from Apocalypse Now. The death from above idea was very much in the back of our minds. And also the great thing about working with Matt was that he's not only very trained in theater, but also in fine art. And most of my references visually, I tend to lean much more on fine art than on, other movies that have come out and so on and so forth in terms of the light and the mood and the tone, because, it's all been done before between Leonardo da Vinci and right up to John Singer Sargent and Winslow Homer and everybody in between, the Dutch masters and, Georges de la Tour, Caravaggio, all of them are a good starting point. And the painting that I respond to, because it's in a palette that I really like, which tends to be very warm, was JMW Turner, where and what I was aiming for and what I think we achieved, partly practically, but also with the help of the visual effects department, was a sense that the whole scene was lit by sun, but heavily filtered by smoke and the occasional cloud that would go over. So what having all that smoke did was that it made it possible to have a couple of shots cut together. One might have been in sun, one might have been in heavily filtered sun, but they wouldn't throw the viewer out of the story by, dramatically visually bumping the way it would, in an extreme example where, and we've all seen it in movies and TV shows, because it's sometimes unavoidable, where several of the shots, you'll have shots in bright backlight sunlight. The next shot, it's the sun's from directly above because it was shot a week later at noon instead of at 4 p.m.
Yeah.
And another one, you can almost sense rain or what have you, and it's cold and overcast. And even the best digital technology makes it very hard to have that stuff not bump. So that's the long version of what my biggest challenge was. In terms of all the other little elements that you have in a scene like that, and the ones that sort of, my initial reaction to reading the scene was just this sinking feeling, knowing that it was going to be a long, slow, laborious process, because you have so many massive elements that have to be brought together for each shot. There's nothing was simple. Whether it's mustering 400 extras and getting them all made up at the right stage of makeup, depending on what point the battle was in, to dealing with horses and safety issues and fire and all that stuff. I've done enough big action set pieces between television and the features that I've worked on that I knew that was going to be it's just really, really laborious. And as a cinematographer, you have to really rely on a lot of patience because you're waiting for everybody else to, get all their elements ready for your camera, even if the camera's been ready for a while. So it's a different style of filmmaking, and quite frankly, not my favorite. I mean, as a cinematographer, I'd rather walk into a dark stage and treat that like a blank canvas that I can then start turning lights on and molding and sculpting the light and finding a simple camera move to film as elegantly as possible.
It's interesting to hear you talk. As you're describing the loot train battle, I can almost hear in your voice that you're still overwhelmed by it, even though it was so long, even though it's already been done, it's been a success. But you can hear in your voice, just going back to that time of the weight of that scene on you must have been incredible. And what, I'm watching it and I'm thinking, I just do 30-second ads for the most part. I'm mostly a commercial director, but I'm even thinking just, having to wait for all of the flames to be in continuity and just making sure that all the burns are the same across 18 days. And it's an overwhelming thing to even think about.
It's massive, and when obviously, going into that, there's a massive amount of planning. And one of the good things about that show is that all your prep time is not front loaded. It's sort of spread through the schedule, because one of the luxuries of having, all the directors and all the DPs sharing the two crews all the time is that you're not actually shooting every single day. So you do have some down days to a fair few non-shooting days when you can really focus on this stuff increasingly as you get closer to the day. And with any sequence like that, the only way to get through it is it's one shot at a time, and you have to know exactly what those are well in advance. And obviously in a sequence like that where visual effects play such an important element, and visual effects are so expensive, especially there were very few shots that weren't touched by visual effects, in however small a way, after the dragon strikes. And so really a lot of the creative process went on weeks and months in advance when that scene was being prevised, so that it could be budgeted accurately and we knew what we were getting into and the order that we were going to do it. And really, that's the only way to tackle something like that is, you've got this huge block of marble in front of you, and you just have to whittle it down one tiny chip at a time.
I want to talk about the camera motion. We have a perspective from the dragon from up high. We also have tons of moving cameras following the horses and the battle scenes. Can you talk to us a little bit about your strategy for the motion cameras?
Yeah, I tend to the longer I do this, the more I tend to delegate. We collectively got together. Once we made sure everybody understood what the nature of each of those shots were, then they weighed in on what the best vehicle or the best conveyance was going to be, and we really didn't want to use cable cam if we could help it, but at the end of the day, it was the only way to do repeatable moves. For instance, in order to fill the battlefield up with have it look like there are 5,000 horsemen riding down a hill, and you only have 50, which doesn't sound like a lot, but 50 guys on horses is a great deal, but it's certainly not enough to fill up an expansive area.
Yeah.
You have to do it with multiple passes with a perfectly repeatable camera, and the only way to do that was off of cable cam, and we had several passes that we had to do that from. And it took a long time to move the cranes around. So we scheduled other work in between moving this very heavy equipment around and resetting it for other versions. Usually we tried to have them do that overnight. So I think in the end we had 3 different vehicles that we used for traversing the terrain, and it really came down to what terrain we were on, how fast we had to go, and so forth. And then we fitted one of several stabilized heads to those vehicles.
And that cable cam was our overhead Dragon perspective shot. That's what we're talking about?
That's right. And, in some versions that didn't need multiple passes, we technically could have used some kind of a remote helicam of some sort on. But HBO has very strict rules about using them anywhere near people, and we couldn't do that. We did use it for a nice long shot down over the lake as she approaches the battle, but that was really about it. And the rest we had to do off the cable cams and more conventional camera conveyances. But at the end of the day, we used just about every type that there is, but each one was very much tailored to a specific use in a specific shot. And you think that there'd be an unlimited budget for having all this stuff just sitting there for when you want it, but in fact, we only had certain items for certain days, and they would come and go, and we'd have to make sure that we stayed on schedule and stayed to our very tight timetable, so that the day that a particular tracking vehicle was available, or the days that it was available, we were using it for what we needed it for. And quite frankly, there were a few times when, it would have been nice to have had more stuff there, but, the budget is absolutely not unlimited, and you have to schedule all that stuff very carefully.
I want to talk about an idea called interactive lighting that I read about in one of the articles that you've done about this episode. What does that mean, and how were you using that in these Dragon attacks?
Well, obviously, when a huge fireball is going off, or something in proximity to characters or objects, you would reasonably expect to see an effect of that light on them. But because the fire was all being added, or a great deal of the fire was being added after the fact, other than the obvious pyrotechnics that we added on the ground, we had to create the effect of that light on surrounding objects. For instance, if some of the soldiers were being set alight, the ones adjacent to them, you would expect to see some effect of that light on them. But the problem is, our movie lights, aren't close to bright enough to overcome the natural daylight. So that was just another sort of level of difficulty that got added, because it meant that all those shots where we were adding interactive light, which I think I was using big old conventional brutes on dimmers, had to be done either very early in the day or very late in the day when the light was starting to fall. And in fact, all of our fire sequences we tried as much as possible to do late in the day when we weren't competing with hard sunlight. So it was just one of the other dozens and dozens of little scheduling elements that the assistant director had to factor into his time frame. And also, the special effects people had to sort of time their placement and readiness according to that schedule as well.